I come to you in the name of my ancestors before me. Medicine.
Humans first encountered cannabis as hemp over 10,000 years ago. It was being used by the people as food, seed, fiber, and rope. Hemp is not naturally psychoactive, so cannabis developed over thousands of years of selective breeding. Hemp was well integrated into our lives and bodies long before we hybridized a high THC strain. It was already sacred, revered, and cherished as a relative. Cannabis is a superfood. The seeds have a complete protein, 3-to-1 omega ratio, are rich in magnesium, zinc, iron, and so much more. They contain rare essential fatty acids, GLA and SDA, that digest directly, bypassing the need of an enzyme that most adults cannot produce because of stress. These oils directly reduce brain inflammation, so eating the seeds alone can improve mental health. Today we use the whole cannabis plant and process it into powders, oil, milk, flour, and even the raw leaf is juiced, delivering potent anti-inflammatories with zero psychoactive effects. Our methods of extraction has improved, and so changes our relationship with the plant. Importantly, sourcing is everything. Since cannabis is a bioremediator, if grown in contaminated soil, the plant meant to heal actually picks up toxins known to harm. Canada's licensed producers are approved to use pesticides and plant growth regulators, and heavy metals have been found in legal products above allowable limits. These contaminants store in our fat cells, they compromise the microbiome, and the cascade from there touches everything. Since cannabis modulates the endocannabinoid system, developed since its first use, it regulates pain, mood, inflammation, and our immune response. Today, cannabis is being used for multiple conditions using methods like transdermal patches, sublingual sprays, suppositories, and topical application. They are even being used as IV therapy in clinical trials, with unfavorable results so far. Companies like Dragonfly Earth Medicine, a Canadian company, compound full-spectrum CBD with medicinal mushrooms and adaptogens from plants and fungi grown regeneratively, so as not to harm and to treat the whole person. For thousands of years across every inhabited continent, cannabis was held sacred. More cultures have used cannabis than any other plant in human history. Cannabis heals the soil it's grown in. It feeds the body. It modulates the mind. And when held with intention, it opens the spirit. No other single plant does all of that.
There's a clear evidence for the ritual sacramental use of cannabis dating back at least 3,500 years. The cultures that used it span China, India, Egypt, Persia, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas. Let's take a look inside the history and prohibition of cannabis. Spiritual use of cannabis was documented in the ancient Hindu text, the Atharva Veda, between 2000 and 1400 BCE. It identifies cannabis or bhang as one of the 5 sacred plants, which release us from anxiety. It's a source of happiness, a joy giver. Today, as then, consumption of bhang is believed to cleanse sins, aid in meditation, and unite the devotee with Shiva. Further along in history, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus described the funerary rites of the Scythian nomadic people. The Scythians take cannabis seed and throw it on the red-hot stones. It smolders and sends up such billows of steam smoke that no Greek vapor bath can surpass it. The Scythians would howl with joy in these vapor baths. In 2019, elevated levels of THC were identified on wooden braziers found in Scythian graves. The Taoist shamans of ancient China, the Wu, used cannabis with ginseng to commune with spirits, to project consciousness beyond ordinary time. Chemical analysis of a limestone altar at Telerad, an Israelite shrine, dating to 750 BC, identified residues of cannabis alongside frankincense. This is the first direct physical evidence linking cannabis to ancient Judean religious practice. And then we find in the Islamic world, Sufi mystics revered hashish as a means to approach annihilation of the ego in divine union, the highest state a human being could reach. And then in the 20th century arose Rastafarianism, in which cannabis is not a recreational drug, but a sacrament pointing to inner divinity and aiding in the healing of the nation. Rastafarian Bob Marley maintained that cannabis prohibition is a tool of political oppression, and this does seem to be the case. It appears as if powerful classes fear a technology that helps individuals reach beyond the self, perhaps because a person who has directly experienced ego dissolution is harder to control. Let's look at the timeline of suppression. The suppression of cannabis does not begin in the 20th century. As we travel back in time, the Taoist Wu shamans were displaced and suppressed by the rise of the Confucian Han dynasty in the early years of the Christian era. In the 13th century CE, the Egyptian ruling classes raided and burned cannabis farms, executed farmers, hashish users had their teeth pulled. In the 15th century, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull which condemned cannabis as satanic and set off 2 centuries of witch-hunting hysteria, directed at female healers who carried Europe's indigenous plant knowledge. In the 20th century, cannabis was delegitimized on the world stage at 2 major international conventions, rendering Shiva's bhang, Rastafarian chalices, and Sufi Dakar circles illegal under international law. It should be noted that the Indian state defended bhang as essential to religious practice. In the US, they found a way to fabricate stories of violent immigrant communities and jazz musicians who threatened social order, which drove the Marijuana Tax Act through Congress in 1937 against the opposition of the American Medical Association. Then Nixon's 1971 war on drugs used marijuana laws as a pretext to pursue hippies protesting in the Vietnam War. And since 1986, mandatory minimum sentencing for simple possession has disproportionately devastated Indigenous and African-descended communities. Now, in the 21st century, the pendulum is swinging back towards legalization, but incalculable harm has been done by prohibition of this sacred plant. The historical record spans 6,000 years across dozens of independent civilizations, all arriving at similar conclusions about this plant's utility for healing, ceremony, and consciousness. The prohibition spans 87 years, and its architects, in several documented cases, admitted that public health was not the primary motivation. What the evidence asks us is to consider is not whether this plant has value. The record on that question is extensive. What the evidence asks us is how a documented sacred technology became in less than a century a criminal act and whose communities absorbed the cost of that transformation.
Cannabis was officially criminalized in 1923 under the Opium and Narcotic Drug Act. Interestingly, there was a very public little debate at the time. In 1961, the Narcotic Control Act significantly increased penalties, reinforcing a tough-on-crime approach. In 1996, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act maintained prohibition. For decades, possession could result in criminal charges. These records often have long-term social and economic consequences affecting employment, travel, and education. If we skip forward to 2001, federal regulations were introduced to allow medical cannabis access. In 2018, the Cannabis Act legalized recreational cannabis nationwide, making Canada the second country in the world to do so. Points to anybody who knows the first. We will come back to this timeline later. Cannabis enforcement didn't happen in isolation. It occurred within a broader colonial justice system. Indigenous peoples have been disproportionately policed and incarcerated in Canada. Criminalization reinforced systematic inequities that already existed due to colonial policies. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 recognized ongoing harms within Canada's justice system, which provides an important context when examining cannabis enforcement. In 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into effect, strengthening protections for liberty and security of the person. Section 7 became particularly important in legal challenges. In the late 90s, the Supreme Court recognized that denying access to medical cannabis would violate individual rights. In 2018, the Cannabis Act legalized recreational cannabis. The Cannabis Act in 2018 established a comprehensive framework for the regulation of cannabis in Canada. The goals were to reduce youth access, limit illicit market, and enhance public health and safety. There are ongoing debates that focus on record suspensions, equity in the cannabis industry, and Indigenous jurisdiction over regulation. Overall, Canada's cannabis policy reflects a significant transition from prohibition rooted in social control to a regulated framework shaped by rights and public health considerations. But this conversation continues, especially related to reconciliation and equity.
So the main strains of cannabis, sativa and indica. There's also ruderalis. The active constituents. So there's over 120 cytocannabinoids that are identified, but primarily the psycho ingredient is THC, as well as there's the CBD non-psychoactive component. There are also over 200 terpenes, which can contribute to the effect of the plant. So with the pharmacokinetics, there's 3 forms of administration: inhaled, oral, and oral mucosal. They both have their different onsets and bioavailability. It does seem like the oral mucosal spray is the best in terms of safety. Metabolism. So we have the liver that's going to be metabolizing the cannabinoids. There's 3 major enzymes. And there's also something to note where there's a genetic polymorphism, which can expose someone to 2 to 3 times the effect of THC for some people. Pretty common in the population. I think it was like 35%. So contraindications. So it can be contraindicated with quite a few different folks. So psychotic disorders, cardiovascular disease, severe psychiatric illness, pregnancy, renal or hepatic disease, so that's liver or kidney, as well as substance use disorders. And we want to be cautious with adolescents for their ongoing brain development. So adverse effects could have anxiety, psychotic symptoms, altered perception, cognitive impairment, tachycardia, as well as motor impairment, so like driving or operating machinery, and drug interactions. So there are definitely drug interactions with the same enzymes that break down cannabinoids. So anticoagulants, anti-epileptics, and immunosuppressants, as well as the sedation effect with opioids and benzodiazepines. So we want to be really careful with all of those. And as well as cannabis dependency. So if anyone has prior substance use disorder, alcohol use, nicotine dependence, opioid use disorder, we want to be careful with those folks. Dosage administration. So there's different modes of administration. And in terms of dose, we always want to say start low, go slow. And so you could see the dosage there. And cannabis normalization. So since legalization in Canada, cannabis use has increased, and this may cause some increased public health risk because it's so normalized. So for medical use, there are lots of folks that use it for chronic pain, anxiety, and sleep disorders. And for the entheogen or spiritual use, with psychedelics, it seems to be more rare. So whereas cannabis, people use it much more frequently, while only 25% of cannabis users report spiritual motivations. However, with spiritual users, they do report insight, connectedness, joy, and transcendent experiences. All right, and that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Let's shift our focus now to briefly look at how cannabis is being intentionally engaged with today. While cannabis is widely known as a recreational or medical substance, many are re-engaging with it as an entheogen, a plant medicine used relationally to facilitate introspection, insight, consciousness, connection. This perspective reframes cannabis not simply as something we consume, but as something we enter into relationship with. One contemporary model comes from Daniel McQueen, who explores how cannabis, when used thoughtfully and intentionally, can function as a psychedelic medicine, creating intentional altered states, supporting inner exploration, healing, and insight. The image on this slide is from my own journey in a virtual cannabis circle held by Rich, who we met in class last semester and who studied under Daniel McQueen. McQueen offers us a toolkit for the conscious use of cannabis, mindful journey work. He emphasizes the importance of the sacred container we create when working with this medicine. Setting, and skill. Strategic blending, he argues for the use of the whole flower with diverse terpene profiles rather than concentrates, stating that THC is like the booster rocket and the terpenes are like the navigation coordinates. The THC takes you there, but the terpenes determine where there really is. And some of the potency in the work with cannabis in this way is that it's consent-based. It has a pause button, unlike other psychedelics, and you retain agency in your mindful journey work. McQueen is not alone in proposing that cannabis can function as a psychedelic medicine and that its effects and impact parallel those from the more classic psychedelics. Research has shown that some cannabis users report emotional breakthroughs and shifts in dysfunctional thinking patterns, and also that they're intentionally using cannabis in meditation, ritual, and spiritual practices. And early clinical literature includes a case report describing cannabis-assisted psychotherapy in supporting trauma processing for a client with complex dissociative PTSD. These early findings echo what Daniel McQueen describes as a broader pattern of intentional entheogenic engagement with cannabis. Seen this way, cannabis may be undergoing a cultural reframing, being rediscovered as a relational medicine, one that invites intention, reverence, relationship, and respect. And as this relationship reemerges within a regulated, commercialized landscape, questions about overuse highlight the importance of intention, context, and care. McQueen offers us not just a toolkit, but a call to action. And he states that cannabis might just be the most accessible and effective psychedelic medicine we have available for healing and transformational practices.